Hello and greetings from the west coast of Canada. I am Keith McLaren and I'm the author of A Race for Real Sailors, and I welcome you to the Bluenose 100 celebrations in Lunenburg. I would dearly love to be there with you in person, but sadly it is not to be this year. But I am honored to be a small part of the festival and to be able to send my greetings your way. I am, and I'm sure Captain Phil will attest to this, a big Bluenose fan, and I have been for a long time. I pretty much grew up with the Bluenose. Above the fireplace in my grandfather's house in Victoria stood a large model of the Bluenose. This model was given to my grandfather in Halifax upon his retirement in 1935 by the one and only Captain Angus Walters. So I heard the odd tale or two of the Bluenose, as my grandfather had witnessed some of these races firsthand, and I still have that model, and it's a treasured possession. I moved to Nova Scotia in the early 70s to go to school and became quickly entranced by the Bluenose 2 sitting alongside at Olin's Wharf in Halifax. I walked down one day in 1975 and asked for a job, and to my surprise, they gave me one. That decision opened up a whole new world for me. Working on the Bluenose 2 was my first experience working on a sailing ship, and it became a defining moment in my 50-year sea career. And being part of the Bluenose 2 alumni, well, that connected me to Nova Scotia in ways I just never would have thought possible. And I still consider it my second home. Crewing aboard the Bluenose 2 informed me in the best possible way on how important the Bluenose is and how important her story is to Canada, and what a story it is. I personally think that this story stands as one of the great maritime tales of North America. It's hard to believe it today, but especially in our world of instant notifications and overloads of information, just how popular the international fishermen's races were. It was front page news in just about every newspaper in both countries from coast to coast. And it still holds resonance. Even today you can head down to the docks and taverns in Gloucester, Massachusetts and get a real earful if you bring up the subject Bluenose. Their bitter defeat at the hands of Nova Scotians still rankles to this day, and nothing they can do can change that. Her victory is set in stone. So the Bluenose became a national icon, her name became synonymous with success, and the Bluenose story became one of the building blocks of her national identity. When I set out to start writing A Race for Real Sailors, I had one thought in mind, and that was to write as full and fair a story of the races that I could, and that meant it had to be told from both sides of the border. Not just the victories and successes, praise and glorification, but the whole undercurrent and turmoil and emotions that ran rampant throughout the whole series of races. And it made for a far richer story, and more colorful and compelling, without disturbing the Bluenose legacy. These were fishermen, after all, strong-willed, independent-minded individuals with a fierce work ethic and absolutely no use for rules. And I'm sure my friend Marq, with his excellent book, Witch in the Wind, would agree. There is just so much more to be told. We both pretty much started working on our books concurrently, and the fact that both of our books succeeded shows that we're still plenty of material to be discovered. And what a story it is. It's full of characters as rich and complex as anything you could hope for, set in a tight community of fishermen who worked in a very hazardous and dangerous trade and competing totally out of their element in a high-profile, highly charged sporting event that captivated the hearts and minds of two nations. In my mind, it just doesn't get any better than that. I wish I could be there with you today and taking the talks with Captain Phil, Devin, and Marq, and I hope you enjoy yourselves, and it's great having a chance to talk to you. So thank you for your time, and I hope you have a great weekend.
My name is Jeff Mercer. I'm Deputy Chief Librarian of the South Shore Public Libraries, who are putting on the Lit Fest this weekend, and we're happy to be partnering with Bluenose 100 to do this event this afternoon. So, Captain Phil, if you don't mind, come on up. little technological and COVID interaction here, so it should be interesting. Okay, so just a little introduction on the captain here. Captain Watson started sailing in Mahone Bay when he was 10 years old. And by 16, he'd begun schooner sailing, and by 21, a friend convinced him to apply as a deckhand on the Bluenose 2. And he's never looked back, apparently. Having worked on the Bluenose 2 now for more than 30 years, and many of those as captain, one of his favorite things is seeing people come out to meet the ship, seeing cars along the roads throughout the province, people standing along the shore waving, people posting photos of the ship out of their kitchen windows, and boats sailing, motoring, or paddling out to meet the ship. What has kept him coming back each year? Well, mortgage. There's the real reason. But what we're going to say is that it's a combination of the technical challenge, seeing the positive change in your young crew every year, looking after something he really cares about, and his dedication to preserving a Canadian icon. So, welcome, Captain. Did you want to say a few things?
Yeah, I wanted to say, absolutely. I just wanted to start, being at Lit Fest, you don't realize, for me, I read a lot of books, but you don't realize how much people put into them to get them written. And I didn't realize that until I was sitting in the chart room one day and I heard a kerfuffle on the wharf, and I looked out the porthole, and Keith McLaren is coming for his book launch, and he's standing on the wharf, jumping up and down like a little kid. So that looks like a little kid. He is so excited, and I began to realize then how much time and effort and passion the writers put into these books and into their works, and how much we get out of it, but we don't always see the passion and everything that goes into it at the other end. So that was a real hard example for me of how excited somebody was to be attached to that thing. Anyway, it's a cool story about Keith. He's just like a little kid. So.
Okay, well, so we did talk a little bit about your career, just kind of summed it up there, but if you could tell us a bit more about your career and sort of how it led you to the Bluenose and what drew you to the Bluenose initially.
So, started sailing at 10 years old. I did some time at the Lunenburg Lit Club. Not time, that's a bad way to start. Started sailing at the Lunenburg Lit Club. I was blessed to be able to go to a sailing camp in Ontario. And I don't know what it is about the water. My family's not particularly water oriented, but I was certainly drawn to the water from just a young age, from 10 years old. That's what I wanted to do. There was a schooner called Rain Dancer sitting, which is a Murray Stevens schooner, built locally, sitting on the end of the government wharf in Mahone Bay. And my brother met the captain, and then my brother dragged me down there, and we would go down every day after school and see what was going on the schooner and talk to the captain. And at the end of the summer, I was 16 years old, and he said, "Do you want to go?" "I'm going, I need a crew member." So we went from here all the way up to St. Lawrence, Lake Ontario, Lake Erie to Tawas, Michigan. So I was hooked then. And we had rough weather, and we had good times and bad times, but it was a couple of months that my parents eventually had to call the captain or the owner and say, "You better get him to call home because we don't know where he is." And he hasn't called home after weeks and weeks and weeks. So I was really drawn to it. And then, I mean, growing up here, you always hear about the Bluenose, and you know older kids that have worked on the ship and been around, and you hear their stories. And a friend of mine I was at Acadia at the time, and he said, "That's a job for you. I'm leaving next summer, and you should go and do that job." And that was it. I was stuck there, and found a family that I loved being around, and a thing that I could throw my passion towards, and it was reflected back at me. And there I am. I'm the kid that ran away to the circus and never came back.
Well, not everyone gets that lucky to find their own circus, so that's pretty good. So that's a little bit about what's compelling you to it, but what is it about the story of the vessel herself that you find so compelling?
That's such a big question. I think first of all, it's the all-encompassing aspect of a ship. To build a ship, to man a ship, to maintain a ship, to deal with the cargo. It takes a whole community, it takes a whole province. You need miners and sawyers and log millers and people to transport stuff, and you need shipwrights, and you need sailmakers and coopers and dory builders, and it just goes on and on and on. It's just not a single enterprise that you can take to build a ship. To run a ship, you need to maintain the ship, so you need mechanics and riggers and chandlers and people that are going to feed them and feed the men and make their wet gear. all that. So the story, although the racing is the part that draws us to it, there's such a bigger story to that, such a bigger story to the ship. For them to have their success, they truly were standing on top of a pyramid. That all had to be there. So that means to me, so this just recently, during COVID times, we've been unable to do our harbor tour, so we've been traveling around the province to many, many different communities that the ship may not normally have been there. And people come out in their boats, and then they're starting to tell me about the history of their port. So then the Bluenose becomes the focal point of the talking about history. So if you're in Port Dufferin, they're coming to tell you about the old Dufferin that was built in Yarmouth in the early 1900s and was a steamer and used to carry things around. Or they'll tell you when the fishing schooners used to come in, and they'll say, my grandfather built a fishing schooner over on that shore there. And it just becomes such a focal point for local history. And for the bigger history, because then you can look at, in 1922, Captain Angus took a load of saltfish to Puerto Rico, came back to the Turks and got a load of salt and came home. But the trophy's not tarnished yet, and he's still doing international trade. And, that's just tremendous. The ability to look at any part of history that you want is that's what keeps me coming back. It keeps me interested in the whole story.
Wow. So that's quite the legacy then that you're sort of in charge of taking care of there. Quite the story and the link not just to people here but around the world and in the province and Canada in particular. So that's a big responsibility there. How do you go about preserving that, managing it, and then promoting it? Not just the replica, which is obviously very important, but that whole story.
Dan Moreland of Picton Castle gave me the fun perspective one day. He said, I'm just a Canadian driving the Statue of Liberty around. It sort of puts things in a different focus than just trying to get around with a schooner. And, yeah, as times change, and particularly in the last sort of 15 or 20 years, when kids are not building models with their grandfathers anymore. They're on the computer, they're thumbs on a machine. We all are. And society has changed dramatically. So how do you keep history alive? I think a great way to do it is to have something visible and active moving around. It's the same as Todd Labrador building a canoe down here. You're looking at the canoe under glass, or you're watching him paddle it in the harbor. And both are important, but then I think you have to have both so that you can keep people interested and involved in that history. As time, our society is changing, and as a culture, we're changing in how we interact with the world around us and the world in the past. And, so how do you keep that going? I don't know. I keep sailing the schooner and doing what I love, and I'm passionate about. I'm very passionate about the ship, and I try and share that passion with people. I met an Air Force colonel yesterday that had flown in the 434 Bluenose Squadron, and so he had the whole history of the ship and of the Bluenose Squadron, and then you talk to a little kid and you try and find something that to each one of them that keeps them interested and can keep them coming back and keep them interacting with the ship.
It's a big job. Yeah. So even though society's changed and we're looking at screens more than ever, and you're saying you're doing digital things with your thumbs as opposed to physical things and building models and stuff, it is still resonating with people. It's 100 years, and Canadians still have a connection. They're feeling, the legacy and the importance of this. Why do you think that is?
That's a great question. I think it's because of the broad spectrum of the story. I mean, Man Against Nature has always been a great story. As long as we've been telling stories, we've been telling Man Against Nature stories. Man against each other, the international races. Out on the Grand Banks and fighting storm and tooth and nail, and so those will always be good bases of the stories. And then we have to have a way to connect ourselves to those stories, and that's where the broad spectrum comes in. That you need shipwrights, and so someone can go to Ross Farm and say, oh yeah, there's Coopers here, and there's Sawyers here, and there's a blacksmith, or that all that connects you right to the story of the ship. So if you're starting at Bluenose, you can find a way for you to connect to that ship however you like. It's such a big story. It's those stories, if you're looking at Kipling's Captain's Courageous or any story like that, any good sea story, that Bluenose has aspects of that great seagoing history, or just great storytelling, which these guys have found out and have put down on paper so that we can read about it and learn about it.
All right, so I'm going to let you off the hot seat just a second, but I'm going to pick a question that isn't on my list. Yeah, no, it shouldn't be too bad. I just want to know, when you're getting ready for sail or you're just about to embark, what's that one moment that you look forward to every time?
Wow, just before we embark, that's another great question. For me, modern times, so the shore power cords ashore, the generators are running, the gangways aboard, and everything is quiet, and they're all waiting. Everybody's waiting on the dock and on the ship for the order to let go lines. That's the beginning of the adventure, right? That's the defining moment that you're going to see, is when I let go of the first line. That's when you change from being a shoreside attraction to actually managing a physical vessel. That's got to go and be prepared for anything. So, you know, the other day we came out of the Canso lock, and the forecast was for 20 to 25 from the northwest, and we got 25 to 35 out of the north, which meant the seas were coming right down from Newfoundland. And you know, there's so much spray on the foredeck that I can't see the people working up there, and there's so much water on the foredeck that their personal strobe lights are starting to go off. So it's pitch black and spray and strobe lights going off. But the defining moment to lead to that is when you let go of the lines. So that, to me, is the change between, you know, interpreter and captain. So my interpreting history onto the wharf, and now I'm not interpreting history. Now I'm going to go and live it, and hopefully not make it. Hopefully not be the story. Right? Then I'm going to come back with everyone, and then they'll have their stories to tell, and you can hear that as soon as they interact with someone that wasn't there. Oh, it was a bit rough, and that wasn't a storm, was it, Captain? No, that wasn't a storm, it was just rough. Okay, it was a bit rough. Yeah, so, you know, but it's that letting go of the lines that's, I think, the big thing at that time.
Well, that's amazing, fantastic. Well, thank you for sharing some of your stories, and I'm gonna let you off the stage so you can. I know you have to get back on deck sometime today, so I'll let you go and we'll move on. But thank you very much. Okay, so now next we have an author with us, Devin Kaiser. Devin comes from a long line of Lunenburg fishermen and has spent part of her life on the sea as well. Just see, yeah, that's a bit better. She's the author of Bluenose, On Board a Legend. Yet despite writing a book about it, she realized that she'd never fully understand the experience unless she actually worked on the famous ship, and which she's now done in a variety of roles. Devin studied history at Acadian University and is the research assistant here at the Fisheries Museum of the Atlantic in Lunenburg. Devin, you're up.
Previously worked here at the Fisheries Museum as the research assistant. I worked here for 8 years, and the majority of my work focused on Bluenose history. I was a little girl from Lunenburg, and when I was a little girl, one of my earliest memories would be coming down to the wharf to see the Bluenose. She wasn't based here at the time when I was this big, but whenever she was in port, my mom would always take me down to see her, and I just remember standing on the wharf, and we went down at night, and she had her dress lights up. And I just remember I was this little wide-eyed girl covered in band-aids, and I was just staring at the Bluenose, and I've been in love with it ever since. I came from a fishing family, so I've had relatives go out to sea for years. My father went out to sea, so that was kind of all I really knew. My grandfather went out to sea. I had relatives work in the fish plant here when it was in this building. And so I went and I studied history, and I got a job working here, and I figured that was my way to carry on my family's legacy, working here in the building that was the fish plant and telling the stories of the fishermen and the Grand Banks fishery and the Bluenose. And I have some photos here you can see. This takes you through my time on board Bluenose over the last 3 years. They're some of my favorite ones. In 2017, we were celebrating Canada 150 and the Tall Ships Festival, Rendezvous 2017, and I was given the opportunity to take a traveling museum around to every port that Bluenose 2 visited throughout that festival, and I got to tell the story of the Bluenose. And so I went, and I was so proud to be able to take this around and talk to people about the history that I was so passionate about and that I loved so much. But I had realized I was really missing out, not being actually on board the ship and experiencing the things and the stories that the crew would tell me when they were off watch for the day. So I came home and I returned to my job here at the Fisheries Museum, and I was called down to the admissions desk because somebody had a Bluenose question for me, which quite often happened. So I thought, okay, I'll go down, it'll be a simple question, I'll answer it. But it turned out that it was my editor for my book. So her Bluenose question was, hey, we hear you know a lot about the Bluenose, would you like to write a book about it? And I laughed, and I said, excuse me? You want me to write a book? And I'm very small and I'm very quiet, and I have a lot of thoughts, but I normally, just sit back and observe and read what other people say. I don't really, speak up or say what I think, and I wouldn't even allow people to read my papers in university. I never had anybody proofread anything, and I said, you want me to write a book? Are you kidding me? I don't think so. And she tried to convince me, and she said, well, how about you just write a sample? Just send us a sample, and we'll see how it goes. And I thought, okay, that's easy enough. Quick 500 words, and we'll call it a day, and she'll be off my back. So I sent her the sample, and she said, this is great. How about you send me 5 more chapters? And how about you sign this contract and we write a book together? And so I said, I'm not sure, and she eventually convinced me, and so I gave it a try. I was 25 when I started writing my book in the fall of 2017, and I was terrified. But I did it, and I had submitted it, and as mentioned, when I was writing it, I had known the history and I had known the terminology, but I was really struggling to write it in the proper way that the terminology was for. And so I thought to myself, I've loved Bluenose, I've loved this ship my whole life. Am I going to look back when I'm old and regret not having tried to go on and sail this thing? And so I decided that I would. So I applied, and I thought, if I don't get it, at least I know I tried. But I got the job, and I cried. I was so ecstatic, and I didn't tell anybody because there were a lot of people that I don't think thought I could do it. I'm only 5 feet tall, and I'm very quiet, and people viewed me as a princess because I like pretty clothes and I like to dance. But I didn't know if I could do it, but I knew that I was going to give it my all, and I was going to try. And so my book wasn't finished yet, but I went on board on April 1st, 2018, and I started my first day as a deckhand on board Bluenose 2, and I was there for 3 seasons. So I was able to prove to myself that I could do it, and to everybody else, and I absolutely loved every second on board. It was the best decision that I ever could have made. And I still love the ship so much, and I'm so proud and so passionate about it. So while I was on board, I was finishing writing my book, so I would work a 10-hour day doing maintenance, sanding the entire vessel with my bare hands, and I couldn't even get into my phone because my fingerprint had been sanded off, and I had been editing and writing my book on my phone in my bunk at night. But I finished it, and it went to print. and I was so excited. It was supposed to come out on June 1st, and we weren't supposed to leave until after that. So I was excited that before we went to sea, my book would come out and I would be able to see it. But it was delayed at the publishers, and so we went to sea. Our first trip, we were going to Cape Breton, and our first port of call was Sydney, Cape Breton. And so as soon as we get out past Cross Island, we lose our cell phone service. And literally, as soon as I had lost cell service, my editor had been calling and emailing me to tell me that my book had come out. And so I didn't know until we pulled into Sydney 2 days later that my book had come out, and I got service, and I had all of these messages and calls from my editor saying that the book was out, and from my family saying that the book was out, and they were sending me photos, and a box of 50 books arrived on my front doorstep at home, and I had never seen it. So I continued my work on Bluenose, and a couple of ports later we found ourselves in Bedeck. And Captain likes to send us on field trips whenever he can. So he sent us to the Alexander Graham Bell Museum in Bedeck. And one of the deckhands came running towards me and they're yelling, "Devin, Devin, Devin, I have something for you." And I was like, what did you see? They go, "Your book, it's your book. Your book's in the bookstore." So I ran to the bookstore and I went in and I grabbed a copy and I went up to the counter and I said, "Can I buy this, please?" And the person was like, "Yeah, sure." I was like, I wrote this book. This is my first time seeing it. I'm really excited. And they said, "Oh, you wrote it. Well, will you sign them?" So I said, "I guess so." Sure. But can I buy it? And they said, "Well, yeah, but I feel really bad making you buy it, so I'll give you the staff discount." And I was like, perfect. So I bought my book, I signed them all, and then I went out to the little cafe area and I sat and I actually looked at it. And I tried to process it as best I could, and I still couldn't believe that this was something that I had put out there that people were going to read. So I bought my copy and I put it on the ship, and a couple of the crew members were looking at it at the galley table, and I had to leave and go back and sit in my bunk. I said, "I can't be here when you look at this," even though I was very happy that they were interested enough to read it. And I am very, very proud of it. It's something that I feel very privileged to be able to do, to get my take on the story and to get my words out there. And I hope that I can inspire that kind of passion in somebody else and in people who read it. It's not the longest Bluenose book in the world, but it's unique because it shows people what life might actually be like out at sea and on board Bluenose too, and what life might have been like on the original Bluenose. So it shows you a photo tour of the entire ship below deck and above deck, what all the systems in the rigging are, what they're for, and it tries to explain it so that anybody, young or old, can understand and interpret this history. And then I talk about the history of the vessel as well. And for me, it was really important to talk about the fishermen, because I know we talk about the racing and the Bluenose herself, and she is incredible. She was an incredible vessel. Bluenose 2 is an incredible vessel, and they deserve to be talked about. But as Captain had mentioned, it was all of the other people behind it, and it was made to fish. That was its purpose. And so I wanted to talk about the fishermen and my grandparents who had gone out to sea. Sadly, none of them, I dedicated the book to them. None of them were able to see the book. They had all passed shortly before that. But I like to think that they know that I wrote it, and I like to think that they're happy that I could shed some light on what they had done. So that's my book, and I'm really proud of it, and I hope that you all like it as well. My time on Bluenose too, these photos, there's a couple of me in there. I've always got a huge big grin on my face. I went from being this bright-eyed, band-aid covered little girl standing on the wharf looking at the Bluenose to being this bright-eyed, still covered in band-aids, little girl sailing the ship. So I'm really, really proud of that. Some of my favorite moments on board, my first season, we were lucky enough to be able to go to Gloucester for the Schooner Festival there, and there was a photo. I'm not sure if it had come up yet or not, but I had been put on the helm for the parade of sail that day, and I think that was one of the best days of my life. I remember my cheeks were hurting so much because I was smiling so big, and I remember the captain looked back at me when I was on the helm and he said, "Are you geeking or are you freaking?" And I was like, "Both." Because I was just so, I couldn't believe it. I said, I can die happy now because I've sailed the Bluenose in the Gloucester Harbor, and that was one of the best days of my life. And so again, I had proved to myself that I could do this, and I absolutely just fell in love with it. I would have stayed there forever if I could. I loved the ship, and I loved telling the story of the ship, and I loved going out to sea. I loved the lifestyle. I loved taking in every moment, all of the sunrises and the sunsets and the marine life that you see. I found it all just so amazing, and the people that you meet. There was a gentleman who had come on board that was from China, and he saw a model of the Bluenose when he was a kid, and he said, "Wow, that's beautiful." And so he researched it when he grew up, and he found out that there was a Bluenose 2 that could take you on harbor tours. And so he booked a flight, and he came to Lunenburg, and he went out on a day sail with us on Bluenose 2, and I thought that was just one of the most incredible things. You know, you talk about the history and the legacy and how it spans the world, and that I actually got to experience in real life. So still 100 years later, this story still means so much to so many people all around the world. And in my third season, it was a little bit of a different season. It was last year, 2020, and we actually did get to sail. We went on a tour of Nova Scotia so people could see the vessel, and we got to anchor in a lot of different harbors that we might not have been able to go to before because of the docking situation or whatever the case may be. And so people would be able to come out in their boats and see us and see the vessel up close and see it sailing in or sailing by, and they could still have conversations with us and connect to us that way. And that was another great moment after such a really, really difficult year in so many ways. To be able to be a deckhand on board Bluenose during that year, it just, you know, it made my heart want to explode. It just made me so happy and so filled with pride. So these are some photos of my last season on board, and again, there's a big grin. I've got band-aids on my legs in that photo, but you can't see them. I crop them out. But the ending photo is it's a photo of me in the dory, and the sun is shining on the Bluenose, and that's one of the last photos that I have as a deckhand on board Bluenose too, and it's one of my favorites, and I'm just so fortunate to have been able to experience it. And so I encourage anyone, if you are able to go down and see the ship and get on board the ship and talk to the crew and talk to the captain, obviously. Yeah, it's just such a wonderful experience that we're all so proud of, and we just love sharing it with everybody and sharing it with the world, and keeping the history and the legacy of those hardworking people alive today. So, thank you very much.
And he's picked up a number of languages along the way, including Afrikaans and Flemish. Not too many people can say that, I don't think. He also studied at the London School of Economics at the same time as Mick Jagger. Save those questions for the Q&A at the end. Without any further ado, Marq.
How's the volume? Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Well, first thing I can assure you that Mick Jagger wouldn't have a clue who I was. I remember him very keenly. We shared a class called Cultural Anthropology with an old guy called Malinowski, who was then 85, and read directly from his famous book on the Trobriand Islanders. We never did figure out where the Trobriand Islanders were. Anyway, my book is subtitled "The True Story of the Legendary Bluenose," and my wife, when the book came out, said, "That's pretty pretentious," saying, "Who are you to say that you've got the truth and nobody else does?" But in my excuse, in my defense, I'll say this. This is a brief passage from the prologue of the book. The conventional Bluenose story, the legend of the incomparable queen and her innumerable triumphs, is too simple, too contrived, with too much left out. A body with neither backbone nor heart. The backbone is a tradition from which the Bluenose came. She didn't just spring fully formed from the brilliant inspirations of a few inspired amateurs, or even from the inspirations of a few rustic fishermen. Instead, she grew from an astonishingly fecund industrial background, now largely forgotten. And the heart of the story? The heart is the men who sailed her, fished her, raced her, crewed her, captained her. These were tough men in a tough business, with an almost inhuman fortitude in the face of the savage sea. Eastern seaboard fishermen have been romanticized before as iron men in wooden ships. Thing is, their stories are true. And without looking at their lives, the Bluenose is just a pretty legend, just a ship on a dime, a winning without losers, a queen without rivals, and an artifact without context. First, the heart. Some of these stories I'm sure you've probably heard, and probably the most famous was the story of Howard Blackburn, who was from Port Medway, Nova Scotia, and fished out of Gloucester. He and his dory mate Tom Welch from Newfoundland were halibutting in January 1883 on the Grace Villiers when they went astray in a snow squall on Virgil Bank off Newfoundland's east coast. Welch didn't last out the second day and froze solid. Blackburn kept rowing and bailing and bashing away the ice. After a while, his mittens were frozen solid, and he dropped them into the water in the bottom of the dory to take the ice from them, but they were accidentally bailed overboard. He tried his socks as mittens, but that didn't work either. His hands started to freeze, and so he could keep rowing. He called them into claws so they'd freeze and he could still grasp the oars. As Blackburn put it, I took to rowing again, he said later. I couldn't manage very well at first. My hands would go knocking against the oar handles and pieces of dead flesh the size of a $50 would come falling off. After a day or so, he was pulling on the oars with his bones bare. The gale passed and with the frozen corpse of his dorymate, he rowed for 5 days to the snowbound Newfoundland coast without any food or water. There he was found by the Lishman family, near starving themselves, who took him and nursed him back to health. They were poor, Blackburn recalled afterwards, but my, they were good. They took the wrapping off my hands, the right one first, and the little finger dropped off. Mrs. Lishman took the scissors to cut away the dead flesh, and there was a grown girl in the Lishman family, and the tears ran down her face when she first saw her mother dressing my hands and feet. She stood behind my back and held her apron over my face so I couldn't see her mother tripping away the flesh. They told me, we have seen many frost-burned men in this country, but you are the worst of all. By all signs, you should be dead. In the spring, however, he returned to Gloucester and to popular acclaim. Minus all of his fingers, half of each thumb, and most of his toes. For years afterwards, he ran a saloon, and they came from all over to gawk at him picking dimes off the bar counter. But he wasn't yet done. In 1897, he organized a Klondike gold expedition, and in 1899, he sailed a 30-foot gaff-rigged sloop to England, single-handed and fingerless. He died in bed in 1932 at the age of 73. But there was one other aspect to his story worth noting. His pay was docked for the days he went astray in his dory, on the grounds that he didn't earn his full share. The company paid the crippled and broke sailor a total of $86, some $40 less than his due. Improvisation and resilience of mind were qualities just as necessary as courage and strength. Perhaps the most extraordinary tale of almost inhuman persistence was that of George Churchill and his brother Aaron, both from Yarmouth, captain and mate respectively on the Yarmouth Boat Research of 1,400 tons. The vessel departed Quebec on November the 10th, bound for Greenock, Scotland, with a cargo of timber. 2 weeks out, a northwest gale struck, tearing canvas off the yards, and a giant rogue wave slammed into the rudder, parting its chains and shearing 2/3 of it away. To get what remained, they were forced to change the balance of the ship, lightening her aft by moving the cargo of heavy timber forward, and were able to secure what was left of the rudder by tackles. All this in a full winter gale. The repair held for 2 days, but was then torn away by another massive sea. A substitute was jury-rigged and installed on December the 2nd, but the gear parted within a day and it was lost. Churchill set his crew to knock down the wheelhouse, and using its boards and a spare topmast, he made a sort of steering oar, which he put over the stern, Viking fashion. This didn't work, and it was brought aboard while the cargo was shifted again, this time to get the stern down. Once more, the improvised steering apparatus failed to work, and it was brought aboard and rebuilt. But when the revised version was put overboard, it broke, leaving just enough to keep the vessel into the wind until December the 9th, when the weather cleared just enough to be brought on board again and repaired. Once again installed, the weather, big surprise, turned nasty again, and heavy seas wrecked it once more. The weather prevented anything further being attempted until the 14th, giant seas breaking over the ship in the meantime and destroying the forward house and the provision locker. On the morning of the 14th, a new rudder was put over the side during a lull in the gales, but it only lasted a day or two before it too broke. High seas buffeted the Research until the 21st, with the ship rolling about helplessly leaking with one of the pumps disabled. Weary but undaunted crew hauled what was left of the rudder back aboard and made yet another. It was put over the stern January 2, but it seemed to have no effect. So they turned to and made a second one. This dual system seemed to work, and the ship was more or less under control for the next 3 days when the second rudder was lost in another gale. Heavy weather prevented them trying anything new until January 10, but then the gales let up for a while, and Captain Churchill had the main yard brought down from the mast to fashion yet another rudder, which unfortunately failed to work. On January 25, he made another, which was installed 2 days later, but carried away as soon as it was put to use. They didn't give up and tried again, installing a new rudder, their 11th rudder, on February the 1st. This one finally worked, and when the wind finally turned to their favor, they were able to sail into the Firth of Clyde and pick up a tug that towed them to Greenock. The passage took 88 days. The insurers gave the captain a silver platter, as well they might. So much for the heart. What about the backbone? Bluenose, the breathtakers, he was called in Gloucester, came out of somewhere, obviously. And that somewhere was a deep well of tradition and craftsmanship and of canny business too. She was on the books as plan number 17 to the designer and hull number 119 to her builders, and though they paid her particular attention, she was just one small part of a long, seamless, continuous, and surprisingly muscular industry now largely forgotten. There were other vessels as able as she, others more beautiful, long before her and contemporaneous with her. Not just dozens of them, but hundreds, even thousands, swinging from dozens, even hundreds of shipyards. All those vessels are gone now, and so have most of the shipyards, disappearing into a tangle of beams and planks and weeds and rotten piling, seen only at low tide, is overcome by time as a pre-Columbian city swallowed by lianas in the Venezuelan jungles. Just history, and ill-remembered history at that. To the rest of Canada, the phrases maritime Canada, and Nova Scotia in particular, and industry, seldom inhabited the same vocabularies. But not long ago, it was one of the industrial world's global powerhouses, bursting out into an astonishing flowering of entrepreneurial spirit, grit and skill, caused like so many powerhouses before and since, partly by accident of timing and place, and in this case, partly by the impulses and accidents of the imperial policy. In 1773, a parcel of Scottish immigrants sailed into Pictou Harbour on the Northumberland shore. There were trees aplenty, towering pines grew right to the water's edge, and thick forests and mixed Acadian forests covered the fields they needed to farm. A contemporary account called them dismayed at the prospect. But on the evidence their chagrin didn't last, and they soon summoned the canonists so often imputed to their culture, and just a few months after they pitched their shelters under the canopy, they imported a company of axemen from nearby Truro to help them out. These doughty foresters, many of them Scots themselves, but others imported from the Black Forests along the Rhine, hacked out farmland, squared the newly cut timber, and loaded it into freshly built vessels for shipment to the old country. Thus was begun the trade that contributed so much to the prosperity of the region. For soon the Napoleonic Wars and their aftermath cut the Royal Navy off from its traditional wood patch in the endless forests of the Baltic, and they perforce had to rely on wood from the American colonies. Politics helped the industry prosper, and so did the American War of Independence. In 1786, a regulation was promulgated that asserted no vessel bought in North American colony, now called the United States of America, is allowed to be registered except those captured and condemned as lawful prizes. Colonial legislature seized the opportunity and stimulated the industry by a bounty of 10 shillings per ton on all vessels over 40 tons. There were bubbles in the industry. The industry briefly collapsed when the American War was over, but it soon recovered and trade grew quickly. From 1787 to the end of that century, more than 700 vessels were built in Nova Scotia, and those just the ones their owners registered. As early as 1788, there are records of shipbuilding in Pictou. Within a short time, and for a century that followed, the building of wooden ships was the chief industry of the province. Every little port and almost every cove had its shipyard. And in the middle of the 1880s, an observer remarked that you could stand on any hill and see where 15 square-rigged vessels were being built at any one time. Some of those were cheaply made vessels filled with timber and sold at the other end, but many more were handsomely put together. The consequences were threefold. Money was made, sometimes considerable amounts of it. It also brought forth a breed of consummate sailors, and it turned every little outport into a society of travelers who went to the ends of the earth. The first major increase in its commerce was, as I suggested, the American War. This was followed by another boom during the wars with Napoleon. A further increase came about in 1840. Again, international events conspired to help maritime shipbuilders. The beginning of free trade between Europe and America in 1844, the California Gold Rush of 1849, the Crimean War that once again put Baltic forests out of Britain's reach, the discovery of gold in Australia, and the American Civil War all resulted in bursts of shipbuilding activity. In the peak year, 1865, more than 660 vessels were built, 80 of them more than 1,000 tons. It's fair to say that Lunenburg, populated by, quote, foreign Protestants brought in by the colonial government to act as a countervailing presence to the papist French, was savagely condescended to by polite society in the capital. Here is a Halifax newspaper doing its best to be gracious in 1859. Quote, "Why, these despised Dutchmen have done more to foster the art of shipbuilding in Nova Scotia than any other class of people within our borders. The vessels these people build are marvels of neatness. We verily believe that they lavish a greater amount of money in ornamenting their craft than they've been willing to disperse in decorating their fraus and daughters." Condescending indeed. Less than 100 years after it began, the region had developed a vast shipbuilding industry that during the peak years of the 1860s supplied nearly 1/3 of all British shipping, and it captured a huge share of the world's carrying trade, building up a reputation for smart ships and native-born seamen that was a legend in nautical history and folklore story for many years. By the end of the century, over 26,000 vessels had been built in the maritime, some 10,000 between 1847 and 1867. In 1878, Canada stood fourth or fifth or even third, depending on your authority, on the list of ship-owning countries of the world. 7,469 vessels were on the registry books, totaling 1,330,000 tons. 700 or 800 of these were 3- and 4-masted turn schooners, built for coasting purposes. In a tight little time period, a small company of boat builders and sailors resident on the Atlantic coasts of Canada created a mercantile marine which burst into ocean commerce, made history and drew the admiration of seamen, and thence vanished utterly into the mists of oblivion. Thus wrote Frederick William Wallace, historian, journalist, and romantic. Joseph Howe had some fun with all this in a famous speech in 1854, cheerfully tweaking the mother country's nose. Scotland, he thundered, thunder being his normal speaking mode. Scotland maintains upon the Clyde the greatest manufactory of ships in the world. Vessels glide up and down that beautiful stream like swallows around a barn. Scarcely a day passes but richly laden vessels arrive or depart with domestic manufacture of products of foreign climes. Go into the factories where the mighty engines of her steamers are wrought, and the noise of the fabled Cyclops cave is realized. And yet, sir, the tonnage of Scotland is only a trifle more than that of North American provinces. Her whole commercial marine included 522,000 tons, while in these provinces the shipping amounted to spend a total of 435,000 tons. And then he got to working in his friend George Mackenzie, shipbuilder and mariner. At the time of the Spanish Armada, we read in the old chronicles that England then owned but 135 merchant ships, but some were of great size, some 400 tons, with a few reaching 500 tons. If my friend George Mackenzie of New Glasgow dashed into the middle of the Maiden Queen's Navy with his 1,440-ton ships, I fear he would have shaken her nerves and astonished our forefathers. Frederick Wallace put the whole thing this way. In the ports of the seven seas and the waters thereof, the terms Nova Scotiaman and Bluenose were known to seamen of all nationalities during the 60s. By sheer ability as seamen and aggressiveness in business, these British North Americans had forced themselves out of the polyglot clouds of maritime nations until they were a factor to conjure with in the world's carrying trade. One can crank out the statistics as much as one likes, but the wonderful thing, the remarkable thing, was that this decentralized outport and cove-based industry, run by farmers and at first unskilled laborers, helped bring, in Wallace's words, quote, the wind-driven ship to the apex of perfection in design and brought out in masters and officers a degree of skill and daring in seamanship which has never been exceeded. That's where the Bluenose came from. One of the best known, how am I doing? I'm good.
You're all right.
One of the best known, not to say notorious vessels ever built in maritime Canada was the Marco Polo, a substantial vessel, 185 feet stem to stern, with 3 decks, with 8-foot clearance, starkly constructed of hard pine beams, hackbatack, and other woods. Again, as Frederick Wallace put it, quote, the ship had a clipperish bow, but the bilges of a cargo carrier. She was built on Marq Creek in the Bay of Fundy near St. John, the most godforsaken hole possibly discovered, considering the fine ships that had been built there. At low tide, the place was a marshy creek with little or no water. The Polo was so big, it was decided to wait until the spring tide to launch her, but the launching went awry and she careened right across the creek and burrowed into the mud on the other side. When the tide went out, she fell over, and it was feared she was ruined, but 2 weeks later, after much excavating, she floated off undamaged. She was then bought by English interests for the Australian run, and the Illustrated London News was positively gushy. Her timbering is enormous. Her deck beams are huge bolts of pitch pine. Her timbers are well formed and ponderous. The stem and stern frame are the choicest material. The hanging and lodging knees are all natural crooks and fitted with the graces nicely. On deck forward of the poop, which is used as a lady's cabin, is a home on deck to be used as a dining cabin. It is sealed with maple, and the pilasters are paneled with richly ornamented and silvered glass, coins of various countries being a feature of the decoration. The saloon doors are paneled in stained glass, bearing figures of commerce and industry from the design of Mr. Frank Howard, wherever he was, I'm not sure. But it wasn't just the pilasters that impressed Her skipper on the Australian run was James Nicol Forbes, the bully Forbes of forecastle legend, who took her into the roaring 40s for an easting, where she covered 1,344 miles in 4 days. This was not a man with many scruples. To ensure that his crew wouldn't skip for the Australian gold diggings, he trumped up charges of insubordination against them and clapped them in irons for the duration in port. She went out and came back in 5 months and 21 days, and as she lay in the Salthouse dock in England, she flew a banner proclaiming her the fastest ship in the world. Bully Forbes boasted to whoever would listen. Ladies and gentlemen, last trip I astonished the world with the sailing of this ship. This trip I intend to astonish God Almighty. So that too is where the Bluenose came. Just another short quick passage from the book. Lunenburg, bear in mind, this was now written in 2007, so a little bit of it has changed since then. Talking about the aftermath. Lunenburg is still there, though scarcely as a working port. There are now more bed and breakfasts in town than there are other kinds of businesses, and the blacksmith shop that used to do ironmongery for the schooners has been sold twice, and its fate uncertain. Lunenburg Sea Products became National Sea Products, became Highliner Foods, but processes only the fish that others catch, and its main business is in indicate packaged pastas and chicken. The town is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site. All those brightly colored houses that had been built by trading and shipbuilding and then by fishing are still there, in better condition than ever, made over by come-from-aways, outsiders nostalgic for a touch of down east authenticity. In 2005, the venerable Smith and Rowland yard, which had built the Bluenose, finally closed for lack of business. Clearwater, a major fishing company whose hyper-efficient draggers are symptomatic of the way the industry is ruining the resource on which its prosperity depends, has effectively left town, selling off its collection of 6 wharves and 22 still picturesque shingled waterfront warehouses. In 2005, they were bought by the province and turned over to a waterfront association headed by Dan Morland, which is trying to resurrect something of the waterfront maritime industry. Of what sort and with what luck is still not known. Only a few small shipbuilders are left in Nova Scotia. The Snyder yard at Dayspring is still busy, and John Steele's operation at Petit Revere is thriving on high-quality private yacht business that, alas, burned to the ground a few years ago. But Tancook's Mason yard is just a jumble of pilings. Its former owners gone to Ontario to build fiberglass roundabouts, and ruined also hundreds of other small operations that made the province a presence in the world and brought it such unexpected prosperity. Nova Scotia never did make the transition to steel hulls and larger scale shipbuilding. The decentralization that had kept the industry vibrant in the days of wood made the transition to more massive industrialism harder when wood became obsolete. There are no fishermen's schooner races anymore. The few precious relics and replicas in Mystic in Gloucester, Essex and Lunenburg are too expensive to risk in such foolishness and frippery. But every alternate year, Gloucester fishermen come up for the Fishermen's Reunion on Lunenburg's waterfront for the international dory races, and every other year Lunenburgers go south, pit themselves against the burliest Gloucestermen. Even so, this sometimes seems too much for the weary industry. In 2005, the Lunenburg Town Council squabbled over who should pay the doryman's fare to Massachusetts, a mere few hundreds of dollars. Gloucester is the bigger and brawnier town than Lunenburg and preserves more industry, but is also shabbier and more down at the heels and has a harder time capturing even a faded view of its glorious past. So not every memory is faded, and there are annual events commemorating the old days. There's dory races for one. Every July the city holds its annual Seaport Festival at the Harbour Loop, where the schooner Adventure is moored, and the town holds a schooner festival around Labor Day. A popular event draws tourists from all over New England. In the nearly 50 years since she was launched, there has been much carping about Bluenose too. In the early days, she was often dismissed as a promotional gimmick and the Olin company unfairly accused of exploiting her name. The coppers said she looked fine enough. Then they pointed below to the sophisticated Devils cabins, full plumbing systems and heads and all the trappings of a cruise ship. In 1972, the Olins sold their brewery to the Labatt conglomerate and the marketing budget for Schooner Ale Lager dried up. The new owners had no use for an anachronistic sailing ship. They fired the crew and tied her up, and a few months later sold her to the province for $1. 2 years later, she had to be completely refitted for another $250,000. As a gesture, the Olin family donated $50,000, for which they got scant thanks. Bluenose 2 had to be restored yet again in 1995. In the early years of the new millennium, there was controversy over the non-profit foundation that had been created to run her. And some money seemed mysteriously to have disappeared, part of a looming financial scandal radiating outwards from Ottawa. There were some unseemly squabbles about who owned her image. Do the Ruiz have copyright in the plans, and some low-grade lawsuits over infringement. In 2005, the province took her away from the foundation and tucked her under the wing of the Fisheries Museum. Angus's grandson Wayne, who had skipped her for a while, joined the board to supervise her running. She draws tourists by the thousands at Lunenburg summer waterfront can easily testify, and thousands more are thrilled to stand on her deck and feel her breathe gently on the swells. In the end, whether the Bluenose 2 is ersatz or not rather misses the point. She may be a replica, but in many ways she is also the real thing. She could sail, if anything, faster than her famous ancestor. Same hull, better sails. On her maiden voyage under skipper Ellsworth Coggins, who had sailed the replica Bounty to Tahiti for the filming of the movie, she got into a hurricane, into the eye itself, surrounded by winds of 80 knots and more. It meshed in a storm that took 5 days to blow itself away. Sorely testing the new brand vessel has brand new rigging and its largely untried crew. Angus, of course, was aboard at the age of 82. Even brought his own barometer with him, mistrusting anything newer. Afterward he said, "In all my years I only remember one blow that might have been worse, and that was when we brought the Bluenose back after the Jubilee. But this ship stood right up to it. I doubt if we ever shipped a lick of green water." Another time heading south in January 1969, Coggins had the crew take in the mainsail after a dirty night, and when the men were filling it, he saw a rogue sea coming down on the beam. I called out to hold on, and it broke right over us, 20 to 30 feet high. It cleared the deck. The life rafts were gone, the compass was gone, the skylights were stove in, the engine room flooded. And when the decks cleared, I saw one of the men climbing back over the rail and two more yet in the water. One was recovered, Craig Harding, now the senior Crown Attorney in Liverpool. The other, Neil Robitaille of Yarmouth, was lost. The sea is still perilous, but the Bluenose came through yet again. Anyone who sails her or even stands on her deck learns to love the living thing under their feet, because it's impossible not to sense her eagerness to move, her responsiveness, her sensitivity to wind and weather, her thoroughbred nature, her ties to her forebear and her challenges, and to the many thousands of vessels that caught the wind and traveled the world deep back in the mists of time. A really good vessel, just like her mother. Few more minutes? Done. I'm done? Okay, I'm done. Thank you. Thank you for that.
Well, thank you, Mark. That was quite moving, and it's nice to know that there's a grand legacy of which the Bluenose just seems to cap it all off. I'd like to ask Captain and Devin to come up. We have time for a couple of questions, if you have anything, and then I will do some thanks. And I know there is on-deck time on the ship today and tomorrow, so I'll give you time for that, and then some silence later. So come on up. And if anyone has a question, just shout it out or stand up, whatever you like.
I can stand too. So I sat because my knees are not up to standing anymore, alas.
This question might be personal, so feel free not to answer. But Devin, you're not on the ship anymore. Can you tell us why you're not doing it? Because it sounds like it's something you love doing.
Sure, yeah. So I started as a deckhand in 2018. I was a deckhand in 2019 for the Great Lakes Tall Ships Festival, and then again in 2020. This past year, I've been managing the Bluenose 100 social media. I worked in social media here at the museum and for Bluenose too prior to being on board. And the mission of the vessel is to get as many young Canadians on board as they can, and teaching them the skills and teaching them the legacy of the vessel. So sharing it with other Canadians. So I laughed and more people got to give it a go.
Good. I can add a bit more to that. I'm the only one that's never had to leave. And we get a lot of people like that who truly love the ship, love their experience there. But there comes a time everybody has to go. And the way that they got there is because someone else left. And that's how they got to have their time on board and their passion. And it kills me to push people down the road, but you gotta go. They have to go and take those experiences and what they've learned about themselves. You know, am I just a band-aided kid, or am I someone that can take the wheel in the middle of a parade sail in Gloucester? They have to take those experiences and have success further down the road. So Devin's story is common to, I think, probably just 99% of people that have left the ship. They love it. They love their time there. They've made friends that will last them forever and ever and ever. But you gotta go. Is that fair, Devin? Is that?
Yeah.
Anyone else? Yes.
I'm wondering, there's a lot of stories here in the museum and other places about superstitions from seafarers from years gone by. Are you allowed to tell us this? I don't know. Are there still superstitions on board Bluenose that you carry on today?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Can you tell us one?
I'll tell you all kinds.
Okay.
Whistling is an absolute no-no. There's no whistling on the ship. We don't turn anything upside down. Hatch cover, don't open a can of soup upside down. You don't store a can of paint upside down. Try not to climb through the shrouds. Bad luck to fall from aloft. There must be more that you've had.
Yeah. No black socks on board. No fresh cut flowers on board. That meant death, funeral. So that's a big no-no.
No umbrellas.
No umbrellas.
I stopped the Queen of Norway.
Yeah.
Yes, she came with her umbrella open. I'm sorry, ma'am.
And it just changes your entire way of thinking and your level of, what you're conscious and aware of. So yeah, as Captain said, no hatch covers. Even when mayonnaise at the galley table, you take it off and you place it down this way. It never overturn anything. So.
Do authors have superstitions? Do you have superstitions as an author? Or?
No. You can't afford the time. Just don't leave a sheet of paper blank for long.
Speaking of sheets of paper, what you read at the beginning from the paper, is that all in the book?
Everything I read is in the book.
All right, great.
Yeah,
Good. Because I haven't read the book, and now I really want to.
Well, now you don't need to.
I want to.
That's a good segue into where you can get the book.
It is true. It's true. So I'm going to once again thank Captain Phil Watson, Marq, Villiers, and Devin Kaiser. Thank you very much. So in just a few moments, then I'm going to lead the way to Lunenburg bound books on the corner of Prince and Montague, where Devin and Marq have kindly agreed to sign a few copies and maybe answer a couple more questions while you're there. But in the meantime, I would like to thank the town of Lunenburg, the Lunenburg School of the Arts, the Fisheries Museum of the Atlantic, Block Shop Books, Lunenburg Bound, the Bluenose 100 Committee, and the province of Nova Scotia for helping out with the Lunenburg Lit Fest. And I'd also like to remind everyone that if you don't have a ticket for our final Lit Fest panel tonight at the Lunenburg School of Arts, we can make that happen for you. We have David Hubert, Tyler LeBlanc, and Leslie Crew this evening. And then, if you can or cannot make it tonight, we will be doing a similar event next year. September 22nd to 24th will be the 7th annual Lunenburg Lit Fest. We do hope to see everyone there. But yeah, in a few moments, I will lead the way down the street. And thanks again to all of you.